I arrived at Mark's house exactly at 6:30, just as he had texted. "It's just a small family dinner, Mom. You can come a little early if you want." I even brought a freshly baked apple pie, his favorite since he was in 5th grade. But when I rang the doorbell, the door opened only as wide as 2 fingers. Lydia stood there, her face tense even though she tried to smile. "Mom, today isn't a good time for you to come in. We're having guests." Her voice was soft but sharp, as if she wanted to end the conversation right there. Behind her, Mark was standing but didn't look at me. He glanced toward the living room, avoiding my eyes as though afraid someone might see him. From inside came the sound of a wine cork popping, glasses clinking, and the laughter of someone I had never heard before. At that moment, a man in a suit walked past Mark, carrying a bottle of wine, and said something that made everyone burst out laughing. Then the door closed. No explanation. I stood on the porch with the warm apple pie still in my hands and suddenly understood. They were hiding something from me. I didn't know. This was only the beginning of a truth far harder to accept. My name is Helen, 71 years old, living alone in a small house on Maple Court. I worked as an accountant for over 30 years, meticulously recording every detail and saving every bit so my son could have a better life. But as people age, others often assume they're slow, forgetful, and unable to understand. Even within my own family, I sometimes feel like an outsider. I keep telling myself, I may be old, but I'm not weak. I've just stayed silent for too long. If you've ever been dismissed because of your age or your gentleness, you can follow this channel. I share the real stories of my life, so others like me know that we're not alone in the way we're treated. I drove home in silence. Maple Court at night was as quiet as ever. The soft yellow streetlights, a few cars parked in front of the neighbors' houses, the distant barking of a dog. But tonight, everything seemed covered by a coldness I couldn't quite name. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I set the apple pie box on the table. I didn't open it. The warmth was still there, but I didn't want to look at it. The pie had been baked for a dinner I was excluded from. I just pulled out a chair and sat down. My kitchen was small, clean, quiet. The old fridge hummed lightly. The wooden table had chipped paint along the edges. Everything was familiar, yet this silence clashed painfully with the laughter and liveliness in Mark's home. I had once believed that, at the very least in my old age, I would be part of such warm evenings. My phone buzzed. A text from Lydia. "Please don't show up unannounced anymore. It puts me in a tough spot." Just one sentence. No apology, no explanation. I stared at the screen for a few seconds and then placed the phone face down on the table, as if that would stop the sting from rising. I leaned back, breathing slowly. Something tightened in my chest. Not a sharp hurt, but the realization that I had just been pushed away from a place that used to be mine. I wondered, when did I become someone my son and daughter-in-law find bothersome? No one had ever said it out loud, but tonight's actions were enough for me to understand. In that house, I no longer belonged. The kitchen stayed silent. The apple pie sat there, untouched, much like the way I had just been set aside from the life of my own family. I stood up from the table and walked to the jam drawer beside the fridge, the one that always required a firm pull to open. I had planned to reorganize it countless times, but never actually did. Tonight wasn't about cleaning. I simply wanted to find an answer to the tightness in my chest. I braced myself and pulled hard. The drawer popped open with a clack, like a tired sigh. Inside were old files I had sorted through over the years, and in the middle was a gray folder labeled in my familiar handwriting, Mark's Household Expenses. I placed the folder on the table and opened it. A thick stack of bills, payment confirmations, and bank statements slid out. I began counting the marked payments, 1, 5, 12, 27. When I reached the 30th, I had to pause to steady myself. At the 60th, a cold heaviness spread through my chest, and when I reached the final one, number 97, I just sat still. 97 payments, 97 reasons why I had never had a proper year of savings. I opened each bill. Many were the urgent ones Mark mentioned, the plumbing repair, the hospital bill when the little one had a high fever, additional tuition because the kids need a better environment. But others made my hand hesitate. Monthly deliveries of premium coffee, pool cleaning services, Lydia's subscription to a wine tasting box every month, a rather large payment for an anniversary party I had never been invited to. I stared at the list, unable to remember the last time I'd heard the words, "Thank you, Mom." As I gathered the papers, I noticed a thin envelope hidden underneath. I pulled it out. On the front was a wobbly line of handwriting from a child. To Mom, I will take care of you when you're old. Mark had written it when he was 14. He had placed it in my hand back then with the most determined expression I'd ever seen on his face. Now I sat still, the paper trembling lightly between my fingers. I didn't cry, but I felt every inch of the distance between the promise in that letter and the man he had become today. A distance so long that even I no longer knew when it began. That night, I was still sitting at the dining table, the folder open in front of me. The kitchen light was a soft yellow, bright enough to read the papers, but not enough to make the room feel less empty. My phone lay beside me, screen face down. I didn't want to read anything else, but when I stood up to wash my teacup, the screen lit up. I hadn't planned to answer, but one notification appeared. Incoming call. Mark. I left the phone on the table, not touching it, but the speaker had been left on from the last call. When Mark spoke, his voice echoed clearly through the quiet kitchen. "You went too far," Mark said, breathing hard, as if trying to stay calm. Lydia replied immediately, her tone cold. "I was embarrassed, Mark. Your mother stood at the door like she didn't understand where she's allowed to show up." I gripped the edge of the fridge. Mark spoke quieter, but the words cut like a knife. "I told her not to come anymore. I already told her." The kitchen seemed to drop a few degrees. I reached out and ended the call. Not angry, not crying, just tired. A quiet kind of tired, like the exhaustion after climbing too many stairs in one day. I sat back down, clasping my hands together. Maybe I'd held back for too long. Perhaps I'd grown accustomed to stepping aside so that others could feel at ease. Maybe I'd believed that if I sacrificed enough, the family would somehow understand. But clearly, they didn't. And they had never tried to. I looked at the stack of papers, 97 payments. Suddenly, I no longer had a single reason to keep things the way they were. Near noon the next day, the front door was knocked on 3 soft times, the pattern I recognized instantly. Not Lydia and not Mark. I opened the door and Emma stood there, her hair tied loosely into a messy bun, holding a warm box of cookies. "I baked these last night. Not sure if they're good, but I thought you'd like them." I smiled for the first time since the previous evening. "Come in, dear." Emma walked into the house with the familiarity of someone who knew every corner of the kitchen, every chair. She placed the box on the table and studied my face carefully. She didn't ask immediately, just pulled out a chair and said softly, "Are you okay?" Her voice wasn't forceful nor overly curious, just genuine concern. I shook my head, not wanting to worry her. "I'm just a bit tired." Emma didn't believe me, but she didn't press the issue. She simply opened the cookie box and nudged it toward me. "Try one. I used a new recipe. Less sugar, so it's easier for you to eat." We poured tea. The warmth spread gently through the kitchen, which had been silent since last night. Emma told me about school, an unfinished essay, a strict professor, a group partner who always missed deadlines, and a volunteer shift at the library she enjoyed so much she lost track of time. As I listened, something in my chest softened. No criticism, no demands, no comment suggesting my presence was inappropriate. After a long moment, Emma set her teacup down. "Grandma," she said slowly, "I know what happened last night." I looked up. She lowered her eyes. "Mom left her phone on the table. I saw the message." A quiet beat. Then Emma raised her head, her eyes warm but sad. "You've done too much for them. So much that they forgot you need love, too." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, holding my teacup to keep my hands from trembling. Emma stood and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm here with you, not for money, not out of obligation, because you're you." In that moment, I felt truly seen, not as someone to be endured, but as a person with worth. It was the only light in a string of dark days, and I knew something inside me had just changed. The next morning, I put on my thick cardigan and drove to Riverwood Bank. The road there was familiar. I used to go with my husband. He preferred handling things in person rather than online. "It's better to deal with real people," he always said. After he passed away, I continued the routine. Every tax season or whenever I needed to adjust the books, I came here, sitting at counter number 3, where Janice worked. Janice spotted me from afar and smiled the way she always did. "Good morning, Mrs. Helen. It's been a while. How have you been?" Today, that question made me pause for a second. "I'm all right," I answered, then took a seat. Janice opened her computer. "What can I help you with today?" I placed the stack of papers, 97 expenses, on the desk, as neatly as a heavy ledger from the past. "I want to cancel all of these automatic payments," I said slowly. Janice looked at the list, her eyes widening slightly. "All 97 of them?" "All of them." She typed for a moment, then asked, "Do you want to keep the credit limit on Mark's secondary account?" I shook my head. "Close it, and revoke his access to my accounts." Janice looked up. "Including all supplementary cards, payment services, and balance viewing permissions?" "All of it," I said without hesitation. She stopped typing and studied me carefully. "Mrs. Helen, I have to ask this as part of the procedure. Are you sure?" I stayed quiet for a moment, not because I doubted, but because I wanted to take a deep breath. Then I answered, "I'm sure." The words were soft but clear. They didn't shake the way I expected. Janice printed a stack of forms. I signed each page, page 1, page 3, page 5. Every signature felt like undoing a rope I hadn't realized had been wrapped around me for years. When Janice gathered the documents and said, "That's all taken care of, Mrs. Helen," I leaned back in the chair, and for the first time in many years, I felt a light, open space inside me. Not loss, but release. Leaving the bank, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. For years, I had been so used to doing everything for others that when I finally did something for myself, I had to take several deep breaths just to believe I was doing the right thing. I drove to the Harris & Cole Law Office, located on an old street lined with small shops. I had been there many times, back when my husband was still alive. Harris was the one who drafted our first will. He always spoke slowly, never rushed, and never treated me like someone clueless, a rare thing at my age. When I walked in, Harris stood up immediately. "Mrs. Helen, you look different today." "I have a few things I need to adjust," I said. He gestured for me to sit and opened his notebook. "What would you like to change in your will?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the paper I had prepared the night before. "I want most of my assets to go to Emma." Harris looked surprised but didn't judge. "And Mark?" "I'll leave him a smaller share. The rest will go into my personal financial protection fund. I just set it up at Riverwood Bank." He typed a few lines, then looked at me, his tone gentle yet serious. "Mrs. Helen, are you doing this out of anger?" I straightened my back. That question deserved a clear answer. "No," I said slowly. "I'm not angry, I'm tired. And I'm doing this so I can live the rest of my life without depending on anyone else's instability." Harris nodded, as if he finally understood. "That's the best answer I've ever heard." He handed me a stack of documents. "These are the will amendments, the updated beneficiary listings, asset control forms, and the fund establishment papers. Go through each section and sign." I reviewed them carefully. When I signed the final page, my hand trembled, not from fear, but from the feeling of stepping out of a dark room I'd lived in for far too long. Harris gathered the documents, slipped them into a plastic folder, and handed it to me. Everything is now in order. From today on, you stand in front of your own life. I walked out of the office and down the old stone steps. The afternoon sun slanted softly, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel fated. I didn't feel held back. I felt myself, clearer than ever. 2 days after I signed all the bank and legal documents, my morning unfolded as usual. I made tea, opened the windows for some fresh air, then took the watering can outside to tend to the small potted plants on my porch. While I was leaning down to water the rosemary, my phone buzzed nonstop. A long string of messages from Mark appeared. "Mom, the mortgage payment is pending. Mom, the home insurance is flagged overdue. The credit card was declined. Is there some system error? Mom, call me back right now." I set the watering can on the step and read each message without replying, not because I wanted to ignore them, but because I had spent a lifetime responding immediately whenever they were in trouble. I returned to my plants, gently rotating the pot to allow them to receive better sunlight. Not even 5 minutes later, another stream of messages, this time from Lydia. "What are you doing? We have kids to take care of, you know? You're messing everything up for us." I finished reading, then set my phone face down on the patio table. The sun climbed higher and the wind brushed lightly against the scarf on my shoulders. I didn't feel angry. I felt calm, a kind of calm I hadn't had in years. I went back to water the remaining plants, letting the phone vibrate until it eventually stopped. A thought drifted through my mind, soft but clear as the sound of water hitting soil. I spent my whole life afraid they'd struggle, but now I understand. Struggling might be exactly what they need in order to stand on their own. I didn't expect them to understand me right away. I just hoped that, for the first time in their lives, they would understand themselves. That afternoon, when the sky had turned a pale shade of orange, I heard a car screech to a stop at my gate. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. Mark always drove as if he were trying to escape a problem. A moment later, there was a knock on the door. Not gentle, but not angry either. The knock of someone who was falling and didn't know where to grab on. I opened the door. Mark stood there, exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, his shirt wrinkled, his tie crooked. Not the appearance of a confident man, but of someone who had spent the entire day trying to hold together something already collapsing. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "Can I come in?" I nodded. He walked straight into the living room and stood there for a while, as if unsure where to sit or how to start. Finally, he let out a long breath and said, "The mortgage is overdue. The insurance, too. The credit card is locked. You know, you could help me this one time. Just this one last time." I looked at him. I didn't frown. I didn't scold. I simply gave him silence, the kind that made it clear I heard every word. Then I spoke slowly. "If I help you again, you won't learn anything." Mark's head jerked up, fear flashing in his eyes. "I am learning. I'm trying, but everything hit at once and I can't keep up. I'm scared, Mom." "It was the first time in many years," he said. "I'm scared." No blaming, no demanding, just himself. I stood, walked to my bedroom, and returned with a thin, time-worn envelope. I placed it on the coffee table between us. "Open it." Mark opened the envelope. Inside was the old note, the messy handwriting of a 14-year-old boy. "Don't worry, Mom. When you get old, I'll take care of you." Mark. I saw his shoulders tense. His lips trembled. He sank onto the chair, the paper resting on his knees like something heavy he couldn't set down. "Mom," he whispered, voice cracking. "I don't know how things turned out like this." I placed my hand on the table, not touching him, but not withdrawing either. "You changed, and I changed. But what matters now is that you stand up from where you've fallen." Mark lowered his head for a long, long time. No arguing, no excuses, just silence. The first silence from him that truly meant something. When he finally stood to leave, I added one more sentence. "I'm not shutting the door on you, but I have to keep my boundaries." Mark nodded. A slight nod, but different from every nod he'd ever given before. Lydia showed up the following afternoon. I recognized her car from afar, the shiny white SUV she once bragged about having upgraded the interior, a cost listed among the 97 payments I had unknowingly covered. She walked up the steps with the posture typical of people used to controlling situations. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes alert, and her steps quick, but never rushed. When I opened the door, she gave a polite but empty smile, the kind just warm enough not to be rude, but carrying no genuine warmth at all. "Hello, Mrs. Helen," she said, her voice so soft it sounded rehearsed. "Could we talk for a moment?" I stepped aside to let her in. She stood in the middle of the living room, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes darting around my simple home, as if checking whether a 71-year-old woman might be hiding something unusual. Lydia spoke first. "Mrs. Helen, I know there have been misunderstandings lately. We've been under a lot of pressure. If you let us manage some of your finances, everything would be much easier. You wouldn't have to worry, and we wouldn't be so overwhelmed." Her tone was soft, but every word felt like she was looping a leash around someone's neck. I looked at her for a moment, long enough for her confidence to waver. Then I said directly, without circling around, "You want to manage my money, not take care of me?" Lydia froze instantly. Her face shifted, as if someone had turned off a light inside her. "What do you mean? No, you don't only." I cut in. "You want control. You want security. You want your life not to be disrupted by financial trouble. But you never once asked whether my life is all right?" She fell silent. Her mouth opened, then closed again. I looked straight into her eyes, my voice calm but unmistakably clear. "Respect isn't difficult, but it seems you've forgotten it." Lydia tightened her grip on her handbag, her hand trembling slightly. She wanted to argue, I could tell, but no words came out. Eventually, she swallowed hard, exhaled sharply, and said, "We just want stability." "Stability," I repeated. "But whose money is that stability built on?" She went quiet again, and this silence lasted longer. Finally, Lydia adjusted the strap of her purse and gave a reluctant nod. "I'll go now." I didn't walk her to the door. I simply stood there, watching the door close behind her, feeling lighter than I had when she arrived. Around noon that day, as I was folding a blanket, I received a message from Mark. 5 p.m. We need to talk, all of us. No explanation, no apology, no asking if I was available. Just one line like scheduling a meeting for an employee. I looked at the message for a moment and replied simply, "Okay." I arrived at precisely 5 p.m., not early, not late. I carried my small handbag as usual, but this time I didn't bring a pie, nor anything to contribute to dinner. Mark opened the door, his expression tense. "Come in, Mom." I stepped into the living room. The air felt heavy, as if a stone were hanging from the ceiling. Lydia sat on the sofa, back straight, hands on her knees, lips pressed together as though holding herself together. Mark stood near the entryway, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor instead of looking at me. No one started talking. The silence made the room shrink, inch by inch. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice rough from stress. "Mom, could you restore the payments, at least until we get stabilized again?" Lydia tilted her head, attempting a slight smile. "Yes, just for a little while. We're still managing, but it's harder than we expected." I looked at both of them. Not angry, not sharp, just listening. Mark continued, speaking faster, as if afraid I'd interrupt. "I know you're upset, but missing mortgage payments isn't small. We have kids, a lot of expenses. We just need your help this last time." I didn't reply right away. I wanted to hear what they truly meant. Lydia stepped in, still trying to sound gentle. If you let us manage things, everything will be handled properly. It will be less trouble for you. I rested my hands on my knees, breathing slowly. You want me to start paying again? Mark nodded lightly. Just temporarily. Before I could answer, Mark turned to Lydia, his voice sharper than usual. You said Mom embarrassed you. You said she didn't know where she was supposed to stand, but you never told me you used Mom's money as a deposit for the summer vacation package. Lydia shot to her feet as if yanked up. Mark, what are you saying? Mark stepped back half a pace, realizing he had spoken too fast, but the words were out, irreversible. I remained still, not reacting dramatically. I looked at Lydia, and for the first time, she looked away from me. For several seconds, the room was utterly silent. No hum of the air conditioner, no cars outside, just a heavy emptiness among the three of us. Lydia stammered, I only paid the deposit. It wasn't much, and at the time, I thought she wouldn't notice. Mark seized the moment. Wouldn't notice. That's my mom's money, her lifetime savings. Lydia flushed, part shame, part anger. Don't act like you didn't use it. The mortgage, the credit card, that's different, Mark snapped, but you hid the vacation from me. I stayed quiet. I didn't need to say anything. I had already seen everything clearly. It wasn't just dependence. It wasn't just thoughtlessness. It was deceit. I placed my hand on the table and spoke loud enough to cut through their argument. A family where money speaks louder than truth won't hold together. Mark stopped instantly. Lydia stopped too, her lips trembling. I looked at them for a long moment, not to make them feel guilty, but to make clear the boundary I was about to set. I stood up and adjusted my coat. I will not pay a single additional bill. Mark lowered his head, covering his face with his hands. Mom, I'm sorry. Lydia sat frozen, unable to defend herself. I didn't need to hear anything more. I walked to the door and unlocked it. Not angry, not bitter, just clear. When the door closed behind me, I knew I had just done the hardest thing in my life. But also, the truest thing I had ever done for myself. In the days following the family meeting, my house grew quiet in a pleasant way. No more constant messages, no more fear that my phone might notify me of some fee I had forgotten to pay on their behalf. I began spending time on myself, something that sounded simple but was something I had neglected for years. In the mornings, I woke earlier than usual. I opened the window to let the cool air drift into the kitchen, made a warm pot of tea, and sat down to read an old book I had bought at a book fair 4 years ago, but never opened. The pages were lightly yellowed, the scent of time far more comforting than I expected. When the sun rose higher, I put on my walking shoes and strolled around Maple Court. Each time I passed the small pond at the end of the street, I stopped for a few minutes. No particular reason. I just like looking at the still water in the morning. It made me feel as if I were starting fresh. One afternoon, I stopped by the local market. Mrs. Miller, the neighbor I had only exchanged greetings with for years, saw me choosing tomatoes and walked over. Helen, haven't seen you out here in a while. I smiled, truly ready to talk for the first time in a long time. I've had more free time lately, so I wanted to get out a bit. Mrs. Miller told me about her daughter's new baby, the rising price of vegetables, and the weather. Ordinary things, unimportant things. But they made me feel like I was blending back into the world around me, something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Emma visited me more often than before. Some days she brought coffee, some days a book she thought I'd like. Some days she stopped by for only 5 minutes between classes. I just want to make sure you're eating enough, she said with a sweet worry I had never received from anyone else in Mark's household. One afternoon while I was rinsing fruit, Emma took a small piece of paper from her bag, wrote something quickly, and stuck it on the refrigerator door. I turned around. The note read, "You are not alone." I stood still for a few seconds, not because I was sad, but because I hadn't realized just how much I needed those words until I saw them. The days that followed were gentle. I baked for myself rather than for anyone else. I read until I felt sleepy. I called an old friend in Arizona whom I had been postponing seeing for 3 years, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the peace I knew I deserved. I used to think that if my family was okay, then I would be okay. But now I understand. A little quiet, a little freedom, and a little self-kindness. Sometimes that's all it takes to save a person. One quiet evening, just as I had turned off the living room light and was about to go to bed, the phone on the table lit up. I assumed it was an advertisement or some useless notification, but when I looked at the sender's name, I froze. Mark. The message contained only 2 sentences, shorter than anything he had ever sent. "Mom, are you doing well? I'm sorry." I read it over and over. No blame, no requests, no mention of bills or difficulties. Just an apology. And a simple question asking whether I was okay. A question so basic that I realized I hadn't heard it from my son in years. I pulled out a chair and sat down, holding the phone in my hands. I didn't want to answer immediately, but I also didn't want Mark to think I had cut him off completely. I typed each word slowly, clearly, wanting to keep my new boundaries without pushing him away. "I'm doing well." That was all. No blame. No bringing up the past. Not opening my heart too quickly, but not closing the door either. When I pressed send, I felt lighter than I expected. Not the feeling of returning to the way things were, but the feeling of something, small and fragile, finally settling into its proper place. I set the phone down. The screen dimmed, but Mark's question stayed with me. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a promise. But it was a seed of hope. Enough for me to believe that maybe my son was beginning to look at himself honestly, slowly but truly. In the days that followed, as morning sunlight filled my house and my pot of tea no longer grew cold from sudden phone calls, I finally had time to look back on everything I had just lived through. Not to blame, not to reopen wounds, but to understand that for many years I had been mistaken. I believed a family would stay standing if someone kept sacrificing, if I stayed quiet, endured, and paid for everything on their behalf. But now I know. A family doesn't survive on one-sided sacrifice. It thrives on kindness, respect, and the ability to truly see one another. I don't need Mark or Lydia to be perfect. I only need them to remember that I am also a person, with feelings, with limits, and with the right to be treated properly just like anyone else. I thought of Mark's message the previous night, the way he wrote only 2 short, sincere lines. Things may take time. He may stumble many times before he changes, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lost in my own family anymore. I sipped my tea and whispered to myself, I deserve this peace. And if you hear this story and see a bit of yourself in it, in the silence, the endurance, the desire to be respected, then you can follow this channel. I still have many true stories. Perhaps one of them will help you see your own family more clearly, more gently. Sometimes a single story is enough to change an entire life.